Well, welcome today to our Wonderful Day on the Lord broadcast. We are entering into a section of Exodus that many people probably do not find very exciting and very difficult, actually, to stay with it. And so this is the kind of material where people who are reading through the Bible sometimes give up. So I want to help you persevere. I want to encourage you not to have to read every syllable as you go through these things. Get an overview, kind of a scan if you have to. Look at more detail if you want to. But you don't necessarily have to do that always. These are things that really pertain to Israel as they were going into the land. And so this is a prep work that God is doing in their lives and laying down some foundations. And we're in chapter 23 today, starting with verse 10. And there's a number of things that they needed to know about before they went into the land. Now you see my props here. This concerns the furniture and so forth of the tabernacle. This is kind of a tease. We're not going to talk about these today. We'll talk about them tomorrow. But I've got them laid out so you can take a look. But before we get to that, we look at some other things. There's about four other things that the Lord wants to tell them before they go into the land. In chapter 23, verse 10 through 13, he talks about the Sabbath. He says, not only do you have a Sabbath personally for people, where one day a week on what would be our Saturday, you rest from your labors, but you also have a Sabbath for your animals so that they can get refreshed. He speaks of that in verse 12. And also a Sabbath for the land. So 6 years they would farm the land, and on the seventh year they let it lay fallow so that it could rest and rejuvenate itself. So there's that Sabbath principle. We'll talk more about the Sabbath later in the week. Then there are three national feasts, starting with verse 14, that every male of Israel were to go before the Lord every year, whenever possible, to worship God. And this was perpetual. This would go on throughout their generations as long as there was a Israel in place and a tabernacle or a temple. So there's three here. The first one is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We saw that earlier connected with the Passover. So the Passover is the final day of that particular feast. Verse 16 is a Feast of Harvest, or of First Fruits. So this is the beginning of the harvest, primarily of things such as grapes and olives that would have come in at different times during the harvest. So there would be a feast as the harvest began, and then finally the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the season when the full harvest is in place. He wants them to keep these feasts in remembrance of Him and in worship of Him. Then he starts talking about in verse 20 the conquest of the land. As they go in there, it says that He'll send an angel before them to guard them. When we look at this more carefully, I think this is none other than Christ Himself, the pre-incarnate Savior, who is going to lead them forward. And He would lead them into the land, and if they would obey Him, then He would, as He says in verse 30, drive the people out little by little from the land, and He would fix their boundaries all the way from the Red Sea all the way to the Euphrates River in verse 31. And He says in verse 33, He says, they shall not live in your land, that is the Canaanites, because they'll make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So the Canaanites need to be forced out in order that they not pervert or pollute the Jewish people in their worship of God. Then in chapter 24, he begins to talk then about the priest and the covenant with God. And here they need to be guided in verses 1 to 18. And he tells them about that, what's coming up there. It's interesting that he says in verse 3, after the Lord tells them what to do through Moses, they say in verse 3, all the words which the Lord has spoken we will do. And they say the same thing down in verse 7, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. They said the same thing back in 19:8. Of course, we know that's not going to work out so well, that they're not going to really follow the Lord in that way. And then the Lord calls on Moses, verse 12, to come up on the mountain, and He was going to give them the stone tablets, what we would know as the Ten Commandments. And in verse 14, Aaron and Hur was to come with them up to a point. Then Moses went on up to the mountains, and there he was with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving these commandments from God. So that's where we leave off, and we pick up tomorrow as he begins to give Moses instructions on the actual worship and how they will go about worship with the people of Israel. So that's what our props are about. Come back tomorrow and see what we got.